every year typically has a few defining moments, right? But 2020 has contained so many world-changing, paradigm-shifting developments that it's getting hard to believe we are not in a simulation that's running every possible scenario all at once, right? From the beginning of 2020, that had to become a byword for all. That was wrong. The worst year ever. Now, political analyst Sanusha Naidu joins us to reflect on the biggest political stories of the year. Sanusha, good to have you with us tonight on the News at Prime. So it's been a COVID-19 year the world over. But COVID-19 became not just a big story because of the pandemic, but it also, to an extent, became a political story in South Africa, did it not?
Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to the viewers. Yes, I think, if we have to actually ask ourselves how will we remember 2020, I think some of us will be a bit facetious and say with 2020 vision, and it will be the pandemic year. But you're right. It started off, I think in the first 3 months before the lockdown started, we did have a lot of issues that we were carrying over from 2019. I mean, the economy had reached a technical recession by the end of 2019. We were dealing with that recession. There was the fallout around the unemployment questions. There were the issues of corruption. So these kinds of political dynamics and dimensions that remained with us from 2019 got amplified in 2020. And I think the pandemic just kind of showed us how important it is that policy planning takes place in addition to spatial planning and other levels of structural planning. And it just amplified everything. So I think the big news story for 2020 would be the pandemic. But I think we've got to be careful and not make the pandemic the central focus or the centric focus of everything that went wrong in 2020. I think the challenges that we have in 2020 are just a spillover and a complete kind of hangover effect from years gone by where there was neglect, where there was derelict of duty, where money was spent in an inefficient way, and of course corruption and tender fraud took place. And so we had the Zondo Commission doing its work, and then all other institutional issues had to stop because of lockdown measures. But I think it's going to be a year where the socio-economic, political, the cultural. I think the other big thing for me in 2020 was how intolerant we became as a nation as well. Not to say that we didn't have these tensions before, but I think questions of racism, discrimination, pushing the envelope on particular issues. I mean, just all of that culminating in the kinds of tensions that we saw the president mention in his reconciliation speech on 16th December. And then thirdly, I think what's important is the unconscionable nature of corruption. The fact of the matter is people who needed the money, who needed to actually have the money in their bank account because of the impact that the pandemic had on livelihoods, just never really resonate with those that are in the municipality, whether in the bureaucracy, in the provincial level, in government. The fact of the matter is, if they thought that this was now an important way in which stealing could become even more important for them, just tells me how unconscionable it became. Corruption became not just a blight on society, it became an unconscionable act. Where those that supposedly are supposed to represent the people, and of course next year is an election year, and it's going to be an important political theater of play. But I think just thinking about how money was mismanaged, the tender fraud that took place, the complete blatant regard for our constitution, just told us that what we saw previously was just essentially a tip of the iceberg of how people actually never had any humanity.
It also not only displayed that level of disregard for the law and our constitution, but it was somewhat, Sanusha, a real litmus test of this renewal of the ruling party, but also a litmus test of President Cyril Ramaphosa and his ability to show leadership within his party during this time and the independence of our institutions. How did it do? I mean, is there real renewal in the ANC from where you're sitting?
No, I think it's in a chronic crisis of paralysis. I think the ANC, in every attempt to try and show that it had leadership, failed to do so. and that just increased the trust deficit. It increased the level of people feeling completely disconnected from the party and the party being disconnected from the electorate. And I think the constant distancing of itself, putting itself first. People who belong to the ANC, who are sitting in government positions, whether at the state, provincial, or local government election, just put themselves first. And I think the pandemic was a litmus test of that. If we thought that it was there before, what happened in this year, it got amplified and it got explicitly exposed through the media, through all kinds of watchdog institutions. I mean, the president tried, and he put in institutions. He tried to create the MPA. He tried to amplify their powers, and all of that with the super SIU unit and so forth. And we're seeing a little bit of that in terms of the criminal justice unit and the MPA going after people who have defrauded. But again, what really disheartens me is the fact that it seems to be that we are sitting in a groundhog day. There's a constant loop that the ANC makes the statements about people who are under criminal charges that should step aside, and they completely contradict their own resolutions.
Talk to me about COVID-19 and how that played out for political parties in general, especially the opposition, because a lot happened in the opposition itself during this year, and whether or not they managed at all with all that chaos that was happening in the ANC to gain any ground.
Yeah, I think the first thing to note is that opposition parties came together quite nicely with the president when it was lockdown 5 measures. They supported it. They showed their level of understanding why those measures needed to be taken. But then it started to disintegrate. So they started off at a very high note, and then that level of support started to disintegrate because then they started to, especially the DA, started to talk about how this lockdown measure is hurting the economy. The problem we're having here is that wherever we move, however we shuffle, when we shuffle, the virus shuffles. And I think to a large extent, what we are beginning to see is how 25 years of not creating a sustainable economic approach to and a model of growth and development, and two things that need to be intertwined, has exacerbated inequality, spatial inequality, intergenerational inequality, and poverty. And I think this is where the tension started to emerge, where in the Western Cape, for example, the DA felt that, these measures were untenable, whether these regulations needed to be softened, we needed to go back to work. People needed a livelihood. So it became the science of the pandemic versus the economics of the pandemic. And I think this is where opposition parties started to take on the president, take on the ANC, and say the ANC is not really delivering a kind of sustainable national disaster management, because at the end of the day, people are still, should we take the approach that lives are more expendable, and so let people go back to work? How do we deal with the pandemic? Do we actually need to actually wear masks? Do we monitor people? And I think where all this is coming to a culmination, Thabo, is right now in the festive season. Yeah. We are watching this play out in the second wave. We have a new variant of the virus. We're not sure how to deal with that new variant. We're not sure whether that people are going to be listening. And I think this is where opposition parties, together with the ANC, needed to talk much more collectively. And I would like, hopefully, that if you want people to take the regulations seriously, it will be very interesting to have a legal expert on your news channel to find out whether we can create legislation that makes wearing of masks mandatory.
Yeah. And speaking of regulations, talk to me about the politics of the liquor and cigarette ban. You can even add to that now the politics of the restrictions on beaches in the Western Cape. That became a story all on its own.
Yeah, it's as if at times the Western Cape is another country, and very often that becomes the kind of rally point. We don't live in a federal system. We live with a system where there are certain areas and certain issues and certain policy dimensions that is devolved to the provincial government to make a decision and move forward on. But what I find very curious is that in the case of the Western Cape, the beaches were left open. The garden route was closed, was a complete shutdown. KZN had
particular days where the beaches were going to be shut down, which were called traditional holidays. And I couldn't understand where the lack of uniformity and collective approach couldn't come through. Because at the end of the day, you actually have to ask yourself, why is it that these are the dynamics that played itself out? And in the Western Cape, I think the bigger question is about the tourism, the reliance of tourism, and what does this mean? I think I saw a picture this afternoon on Twitter on just looking at Cape Town International. It looks chaotic, and it looks like it's full of mayhem, with people coming into the city or leaving the province or the city, and it just looks like there's no control in that in the airport. And I think this is where there needs to be more uniform and what I would say national regulations that apply across the country in a uniform way. It can't be done in the staggered manner where one province is allowed to have its beaches open, another has a kind of a collective calendar, and then the other hotspot just says, no, you can't open your beaches. And I think for me, those become rallying points. And I think that at this point in time, the National Disaster Management Act may take precedence because it is a national disaster. We have to apply this and we have to actually adhere to it. And I think for me, I really thank my lucky stars that we don't have a federal system in South Africa.
The regulations still, they became a rallying point to some extent in terms of power play between the Minister of COGTA, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and President Cyril Ramaphosa. To some, it seems as though she was able to veto the president on some of these regulations.
Yeah, it became almost a kind of reenactment of Nasrec 27. And it became that kind of dimension of how does these different groups push against each other in the context of she saying, well, the president saying firstly that, you know what, we're going to be a bit more softer on the regulations regarding cigarettes, and she coming out and saying it's a complete ban. There's no negotiation on that. And I think those kinds of mixed messaging doesn't bode well for the party in terms of whether there's uniformity in the command council when they discuss these things around who and how they reached unanimity around issues. And I think that exposed the weakness around these kinds of tensions that are spilling over from the party into policy, into the state. And we always have had this conversation, Thabo, about where does the state end and where does the party begin and vice versa. I also think that at the end, in certain ways, the regulations had to be thought about in a much more innovative manner. There were ways in which you had to ask yourself, how do I regulate, but do it in a way that doesn't create these kinds of very parochial, very inflexible, rigid compartmentalization of issues. So you got the alcohol and the cigarette ban, and that was completely a non-negotiable on the part of government because they were trying to make sure that this is where things were going. And some people may have said, you know what, the cigarette issue is a pet peeve of the COGTA minister. And of course, being a pet peeve of the COGTA minister with her regulations around smoking and smoking legislation and where you can smoke and all of these regulations that we've seen in the legislation we've seen in the past around smoking and public smoking in public areas. I think some people may have felt that this was her opportunity to move forward on being much more draconian around the cigarette issue. But what it does is that it creates a space, an opening for bootlegging to take place, for illegal cigarettes to come in, and then those kinds of things end up becoming an even bigger health issue and a health crisis for our already fragile public health system.
The economic freedom fighters, you mentioned this earlier on, playing somewhat of a role, particularly when it comes to the racial tensions in the country. You're talking Senekal, you're talking Brackenfell, but also there's the Clicks saga, which also became a very big issue that they ran with.
Yeah, it's an issue that I think everybody realizes that we haven't transformed. We've got to be honest about this, that the level of discrimination in South Africa, the issues of how people react to each other of different races, different faith, the different in terms of gender, etc. All of these issues of transformation just kind of come to a very, very sensitive space. And I think the economic freedom fighters have used that space to say that these are the issues that are happening. I would have liked to have seen the economic freedom fighters be much more harder on Clicks with that ad. with Unilever. I think they could have pushed the envelope, because this was a very sensitive issue. It was a disregard for human rights of a particular group of people, and I don't think that they could have settled for what they settled for in that whole kind of negotiation. I think that race becomes that area of our political landscape where it is difficult for us to shy away from. It's a national debate. It's a narrative, it's a discussion that we have to have. Unfortunately, we haven't really had it in a way that we can talk about it without getting very emotive and becoming very belligerent about it. And I think the economic freedom fighters have realized that, after Zuma left, this is where the Achilles heel lies in South Africa, that the transformation agenda is still very much a disparate agenda. It hasn't achieved what it's supposed to achieve: land reform, questions of access, tensions around how people are relating to each other from a social cohesion perspective, and it just gives them that kind of leverage to go forward. And I think to a large extent we've seen it as well in terms of how this COVID-19 has accentuated inequality in our country.
Sanusha, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us tonight. Political analyst there, Sanusha Naidu.